The 1,970 seconds were a strange and fearless time for science fiction. It was the decade where filmmakers didn't just imagine the future, they dissected it, rewired it, and sometimes predicted it too closely for comfort. Across aging projectors and dusty VHS tapes, a handful of films dared to anchor their fiction not in fantasy, but in emerging scientific theories, some of which had real traction in academic circles. The concept of alternate dimensions wasn't just a narrative crutch. It was a hypothesis with published papers, peer reviews, and real-world supporters. Biofields, morphogenetic resonance, zero-point consciousness, these weren't invented by scriptwriters. They were once whispered in the halls of quantum labs and fringe conferences before being quietly redacted from journals, labeled unreliable or erased entirely. And yet, the films remained. Some were dismissed as campy, others vanished after midnight screenings. A few were panned so aggressively that their reels were buried by studios. But watch closely, and a pattern emerges. These films echo scientific ideas that were once legitimate until they weren't. What changed? Was it flawed data, institutional embarrassment, or something more unsettling, ideas too disruptive to be allowed into the mainstream? In this countdown, we're peeling back the celluloid to revisit 15 sci-fi films that drew from theories now buried, ridiculed, or mysteriously retracted. Not because they were wrong, but maybe because they were right too soon. These aren't just forgotten films. They are cinematic fossils from alternate timelines, timelines that might have been ours if science had made different choices. So, let's dive into 15 old-school sci-fi films that didn't just predict the future. They challenged it. And maybe that's why they were buried. Number 1. Threads, 1984. There is no soundtrack, no hero, no salvation. Threads is not science fiction in the traditional sense, but it is futurism at its most harrowing. A dramatization of nuclear war's aftermath in Sheffield, England, it shows not just physical devastation, but societal, psychological, and generational collapse. The most disturbing part? How people lose language. Culture, memory, sanity. Behind this horror lies a chilling theory that large-scale trauma, especially at the neurochemical level, can cause irreversible consciousness regression in populations. A few UK think tanks explored this in classified Cold War documents, proposing that, after global annihilation, humans wouldn't rebuild, they'd devolve. Threads aired once. The BBC was flooded with complaints, then largely buried the film. For years, it became a whispered legend. Teachers showed it in secret. Activists used it as warning, but the science behind it, the idea that society's collapse isn't technological, but mental, was never officially discussed again, because it wasn't just terrifying, it was plausible. Number 2. The Lathe of Heaven, 1980. In this PBS adaptation of Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, a man's dreams start changing reality literally. He dreams of peace, and war ends. He dreams of aliens, and they arrive. At first, scientists attempt to guide his dreams toward utopia, but each correction unleashes consequences they cannot predict. The message: reality is not broken, it's fragile, and meddling with dream logic carries cosmic cost. What few know is that Le Guin's story was inspired by Eastern philosophy, but also by speculative neuroscience in the 70 seconds about how human perception shapes quantum probability fields. A few theorists flirted with the possibility that human consciousness interacts with reality-forming processes, not just passively observing, but nudging outcomes. These ideas were met with skepticism, then silence. But the Lathe of Heaven lingers. It's haunting, slow, and disturbingly plausible. Maybe our dreams don't shape us. Maybe they shape the world and we've just stopped noticing. Number 3. Mind Warp, 1992. Before Inception, before Black Mirror, there was Mind Warp, a brutal, post-apocalyptic vision where people no longer live in the world but inside their own minds. In this future, humans plug into a virtual dream space. The outside world has become toxic, but when the protagonist awakens, she finds that reality may be even worse, or perhaps she never left the simulation at all. This dystopia was more than fiction. In the late 80 seconds and early 90 seconds, certain theorists in cognitive science speculated that recursive feedback in artificial dream environments could cause permanent psychological fragmentation. Some fringe thinkers feared that as VR evolved, the brain might eventually forget how to distinguish between input and origin, Shortly after Mind Warp released, funding for such studies dried up. The topic disappeared from conferences. The film itself sank into obscurity despite starring Bruce Campbell and Angus Scrimm. But the question lingers. What happens when your mind adapts to a lie and then refuses to wake up? Number 4. The Asphyx, 1972. A Victorian scientist discovers a strange force in the moment before death, a blur in photographs, a shadow in motion. He names it the Asphyx, and he tries to trap it. The result is chilling. If he succeeds, the subject becomes immortal. But at what cost? The Asphyx is gothic horror dressed as science fiction, exploring the fringe idea that death is not just a biological failure, but a separate entity, a measurable energy field that can be intercepted. In the late 60 seconds, a few parapsychologists attempted to photograph soul departure using early infrared tech. Their findings? Inconclusive. Later, ridiculed. Eventually, forgotten. The film doesn't offer comfort. Immortality, once achieved, becomes a prison. The trapped asphyx becomes a metaphor, and maybe a warning. What if death isn't the enemy? What if it's the balance we were never meant to tamper with? Number 5. Panic in Year Zero, 1962. A nuclear attack hits Los Angeles. One family flees into the wilderness. Civilization collapses in hours. Panic in Year Zero isn't filled with monsters or mutants. The horror comes from the people, how quickly morality vanishes, how fast logic turns feral. A father teaches his son to kill, steal, lie, survive. In the late 1950 seconds, a subset of behavioral psychologists proposed that under existential threat, humans would revert to base programming, not over years, but days. These ideas were controversial, especially during America's golden age of optimism. The theory was quietly rejected as anti-humanist, but Panic in Year Zero leaned into it unapologetically. The film was directed by Ray Milland, who also starred in it. It's raw, blunt, and stripped of comfort. Audiences weren't ready, but now, it feels uncomfortably honest. Maybe the apocalypse doesn't transform us. Maybe it just strips away the story we tell ourselves. Number 6. Quintet 1979. In a frozen post-apocalypse, survivors huddle in silence, playing a mysterious board game, not for entertainment, for survival. In Quintet, the rules are unknowable, the losses permanent. Robert Altman's bleak and baffling sci-fi tale was dismissed as incomprehensible when it released. But beneath its glacial pacing lies a profound philosophical proposition. What if the universe operates like a game not of chance, but of inevitability? A cosmic system where every move reduces possibility, and entropy is the only winner? In the early 1970 seconds, certain corners of systems theory explored decay-driven game models, where players within a closed system would eventually converge on extinction, not by malice, but by probability. These were later buried under more optimistic frameworks, too fatalistic, too Lovecraftian. But Quintet dares to visualize that endgame. Characters don't play to win. They play because they've forgotten how not to. Maybe the rules of reality were never about survival. Maybe they were always about knowing when to stop playing. Number 7. The Noah, 1975. A man survives a nuclear holocaust and washes ashore on a deserted island. Alone, he begins to hallucinate people, then cities, then an entire world. Or maybe he's not hallucinating at all. The Noah is a surreal, near-lost film about a man whose mind begins projecting a parallel world to escape the unbearable silence. But the twist is philosophical. What if that world, constructed entirely by his consciousness, becomes more stable than reality itself? During the Cold War, psychological studies were briefly conducted on long-term isolation and the brain's response to total solitude. Some speculative thinkers in neuropsychiatry suggested the mind, deprived of input, might create substitute environments, not just mentally, but perceptually. Those studies never reached the public. Many were classified. The Noah was buried almost immediately. A limited theatrical release. No wide distribution. VHS copies vanished. But the theory it embodied remains unsettling. What if reality isn't what we see when we're surrounded, but what we create when we're alone? Too long to deny it? Number 8. Zardostisoch 977. A flying stonehead delivers guns to savages while whispering, "The gun is good, the penis is evil." Yes, Zardoz is strange, but beneath the absurdity lies a terrifying theory. Set in a future where a class of immortals rules over a dying Earth, the film explores the idea that eternal life leads not to transcendence, but to decay. The elites stagnate, they go mad, they beg for death. This dystopian scenario aligned with a once theorized outcome in speculative evolutionary biology, that long-term biological immortality could cause systemic entropy in intelligence, purpose, and even culture. Papers on evolutionary fatigue were presented quietly in a few European think tanks during the late 60s. None were ever published in major journals. Was it because the conclusion was too bleak? That our ultimate goal, immortality, could be our ultimate collapse? Zardoz bombed at the box office, mocked for its visuals and camp. But decades later, it feels like an allegory we weren't ready for. Maybe death isn't a failure of evolution. Maybe it's the only thing that keeps us human. Number 9. Welt am Draht, World on a Wire 1973. Long before The Matrix, there was World on a Wire, a German miniseries directed by Rainer Werner Fassbinder that suggested everything we know might be a simulation. The story follows a scientist who uncovers that his world is a program one designed inside another, possibly infinitely nested. His discovery triggers collapses in perception, memory, and eventually, reality itself. But here's the unnerving part. The film was based on a novel, Simulacron 3, which in turn inspired real scientific speculation. In the early 70s, long before Elon Musk or Nick Bostrom, a few fringe physicists and computer scientists began modeling hypothetical realities inside early mainframes. They hypothesized that consciousness could emerge in code if given the right architecture. Most mainstream institutions laughed. Some called it philosophy, not physics. The topic vanished from serious discussion until the 2000s brought it back. But World on a Wire never waited for validation. It simply told the truth too early. What if you're not the one dreaming the machine? What if the machine is dreaming you? Number 10. Brainstorm 1983, a machine that records human experiences. Every sight, sound, emotion, even death itself captured and replayed. Brainstorm introduced audiences to a device capable of preserving memories not as video, but as direct neural sensations. One character dies while recording her death, and another risks everything to experience it. It sounds like fiction, but in the early 80s, DARPA and private neurolabs were genuinely exploring rudimentary brain-computer interfaces that aimed to record neural echoes. The idea? Memories might not be just chemical, they might be patterns, capturable and transferable. A few white papers emerged, then vanished. Adding to the mystery, Natalie Wood, the film's lead, died during production under suspicious circumstances. Some say the studio nearly shelved the film entirely. Others whisper that the death scene she recorded in character blurred lines between fiction and real fear. Today, brainwave tech is everywhere, but nothing matches what Brainstorm hinted at. Not data, but death experienced secondhand. Number 11. The Quiet Earth 1985. You wake up one morning and the entire world is empty. No war, no zombies, just nothing. You are the last observer. And if you die, does reality die with you? This haunting New Zealand film tells the story of a man who survives an energy experiment gone wrong, only to discover that he might be the anchor keeping reality itself from unraveling. It's quiet, eerie, and devastating. Beneath the surface, The Quiet Earth flirts with a real and once discussed idea in quantum physics, that the presence of an observer is required to stabilize physical reality. A radical extension of the Copenhagen interpretation, some theorists in the late 70s dared to speculate that large-scale observation could impact space-time itself. Within a decade, the discussion was gone. Debunked? Or too close to something we weren't ready to confront? What if your consciousness isn't a passenger but a pillar? And if you're the last one awake, what happens when you sleep? Number 12. The Final Program 1973. In a world ravaged by entropy, the only solution is synthesis of man and woman, of logic and instinct, of the fragmented self into one final being. The Final Program is a bizarre, prophetic, and deeply misunderstood film based on Michael Moorcock's dystopian novel. Its central plot follows a scientist's mission to create a new kind of human by merging male and female consciousness into a singular, godlike entity. The resulting being is neither man nor woman, it is something else entirely. In the early 70s, this echoed a theoretical model being explored quietly in cybernetics and anthropology, that gender, as a binary is a limitation on cognitive evolution. Some fringe papers even suggested that the neurological convergence of both hemispheres, typically mapped to gender roles, could lead to a higher intelligence. That line of thought didn't last. By 1976, these ideas were quietly removed from major publications. Critics dismissed them as pseudoscience. But watch the final program today, and it doesn't feel like fiction. It feels like a transmission from a timeline where evolution took a very different path. Maybe the endgame of human consciousness isn't expansion. Maybe it's unification through obliteration. Number 13. Altered states, 1980. A Harvard scientist climbs into a sensory deprivation tank to explore altered states of consciousness and comes out something else entirely. Part body horror, part mind trip, Altered States dramatizes a terrifying question. What if accessing the deepest layers of the human mind regresses the body itself? The protagonist doesn't just hallucinate the origins of life, he physically devolves into it. This wasn't just fiction. The film was loosely inspired by real-life psychonaut John C. Lilly's research into flotation tanks, LSD, and the potential of conscious de-evolution. Some early 70 seconds neuroscience journals discussed regression theories, blending Jungian archetypes with biochemical feedback. But the moment the film hit, that entire line of research was effectively disowned. Grants evaporated, papers were pulled. Lilly himself faded into obscurity. Why? Too fringe? Too spiritual? Or too uncomfortably close to truths about how fragile our modern selves really are? Because maybe consciousness isn't built upward. Maybe it's something we're desperately holding back. Number 14. Phase 4. 1974. Dựa trên thuyết collective intelligence emergence, trí tuệ bầy đàn có thể vượt cấp tiến hóa. Before hive mind was Marvel territory, this forgotten film directed by Saul Bass envisioned a planet where ants, yes, ants begin evolving far beyond anything humans can comprehend. Unlike other creature features of the time, Phase 4 wasn't about monsters. It was about patterns, communication, evolution, not in the body, but in intelligence itself. The ants begin organizing, adapting, and even manipulating human behavior, as if testing theories in a lab. The premise? Inspired by a real, briefly studied model in the 1960 seconds that proposed intelligence could spontaneously emerge in networked biological systems, ant colonies, slime molds, even neurons. But by the mid-70 seconds, the model had vanished from public discourse. Not disproven, just dropped. Bass shot an abstract ending for the film, a psychedelic montage hinting at human-ant fusion. It was too unsettling. The studio cut it. The film tanked. But that ending resurfaced decades later. And when it did, Phase 4 became more than an oddity. It became prophecy, not about ants, about the next phase of intelligence, and whether we'd still be human when it arrives. Number 15. The Man Who Haunted Himself, 1970. Before duality became a sci-fi trope, this psychological thriller dared to ask, what if your alternate self wasn't theoretical? What if he's already taken your place? Roger Moore, yes. James Bond himself delivers an eerie performance as a businessman who survives a car crash, only to discover someone who looks exactly like him has been living his life. But the deeper terror lies not in identity theft, but in the implication both men exist at the same time. At the time, this narrative echoed a speculative theory being debated on the fringes of neuropsychology that human consciousness might not be a singular stream, but rather a layered structure, capable of splitting under extreme trauma. A few academic papers emerged in the late 1960 seconds, but by 1975, most of them had been discredited or withdrawn, often without formal explanation. Why the sudden silence? Was the theory unsound or simply too inconvenient in a world obsessed with linear identity? The film flopped in theaters, dismissed as a strange departure for Moore. But decades later, it's revisited by cult fans not for its thrills, but for how disturbingly close it feels to certain unsolved neurological phenomena. Maybe the scariest part isn't the double. Maybe it's that both versions of you feel equally real. Bonus fact: overdrawn at the memory bank, 1983. And before we reach number 1, let's talk about a film that's too weird to ignore. Overdrawn at the Memory Bank is a low-budget, made-for-TV film starring Raul Julia as a man in a dystopian future where emotions are suppressed art is banned, and humans vacation by uploading their minds into animals. During his upload, something goes wrong. His consciousness becomes trapped inside a computer mainframe, and then things get strange. Within this crude production hides a terrifying premise. Identity is not fixed. It's portable, rewritable. The film casually suggests that the mind is nothing more than transferable data, and worse, that corporations have begun treating it as such. In the early 1980 seconds, some speculative computing theorists proposed the possibility of consciousness reassignment, the notion that, in digital environments, a person's neural imprint could be edited, spliced, or repurposed without consent. The topic barely reached public discussion before being dismissed as sci-fi paranoia. But Overdrawn at the Memory Bank doesn't blink, it leans in. It portrays a world where identity is corrupted not by accident, but by corporate design. The film's awkward effects and budget constraints have made it the subject of mockery, but its core concept remains disturbingly ahead of its time. What if our minds are not the final frontier? What if they're just the next commodity? Some films don't just disappear. They vanish for a reason. Science fiction has always flirted with the impossible. But what happens when it flirts with something too real, too close to truths we're not ready for? These films didn't just predict alternate dimensions. They touched the boundaries of what science once believed, and then chose to forget. So now, we ask you, which of these films do you think revealed something real, something that science tried to bury? And more importantly, which theory do you secretly hope is true? Let's talk in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, one of these dimensions is watching us back.